Environmental Sciences Department. So he's come to speak to us today about ponds. He's got 35 years experience in ecology of ponds, haven't you, Mike?
Yeah, does I
Also,
feel it some days.
apparently Mike used to do Punch and Judy as well. I've also read. Mike's a trustee of Northumberland Wildlife Trust as well now, so you may have seen that because he was involved in the last big climate action talk. I think was that last. I think it was back in the last year, wasn't it? Yeah, we've lost track. And most notably, Mike was my favourite lecturer at Northumberland University. We've got to get that in there. So, so I was at Northumbria Uni from 2002 to 2005, which is a very long time ago now. That makes me feel old. So I don't know what that makes you feel, Mike.
I don't have birthdays anymore. I just get myself carbon dated occasionally.
Well, you still look the same. So there you go. You've aged well. So I did try and find a funny photograph of my time with Mike, but unfortunately, it's in a box in the bottom of a cupboard, and it's just. I'll find it one day. But it was the geophotography you set up, and I took photos of toilets, and then you photocopied all the toilets into very strange colours, and then created a massive collage of toilets on the wall at university. Quite random. But also, I've kept this.
The whole
island field trip.
Field work. Oh, what a joy.
Which I've had out actually recently, Mike, when we've been doing some survey work. So there you go. 16 or 17 years on, it still survived. And there's lots of dead flowers in there as well.
Oh, look at that.
Probably rare species that I pulled out of the ground and stuck in my book.
Oh, what a joy.
There you go. There's a little bit of background, and we'll hand you over to Mike. Oh, I've just realised Em's recorded all that. Do you want to stop recording and then start recording again? Because all of that was quite unprofessional for random people to be watching.
No, keep that in. No.
I can cut it down. I can edit it out. Don't worry.
Head of department needs to hear this.
Right, well, thank you very much, Mike, and we'll hand over to you.
Well, it's smashing to be invited. What a treat, because I mean, I don't usually get out on field trips with students anymore. I spend my entire time doing administration. And Becky's right, that piece of work was one of my favourites. People still talk about it because it was all these photographs of toilets on a stairwell, and the old head of department was walking up and down, and he said, "Well, what's this lovely picture? This is really nice. It adds a bit of colour to the wall." And then about 10 seconds later, he realised what it was pictures of. Everyone agreed it was great, and I kept my job. So what I'm going to try to do now, like all sessions like this, because it is smashing to be here. Otherwise, I would have to be in a much more boring meeting. I'm going to spend the next 5 minutes faffing around trying to share my screen with the talk. So when you talk amongst yourselves, Becky, I'm sure you can talk about all sorts of other things. Let's have a go at this. See if I can get this to work. Opening PowerPoint presentation. The field trips to Holy Island were a joy while this is loading. See, we haven't probably got time to talk about this, but there was the year of the naked Dutch sea captain on the roof of the hotel. It was taken away by the police. And then there was the time when we got marooned and we had to be rescued by Mr. Billy Shield. Oh, dearie me. Now,
yeah, that wasn't my year. My year was someone ate pineapple and had an allergic reaction, and then.
Yeah. Oh, dearie me. Now I've got a thing which says test. Why isn't it opening the? I'll try screen share. Let's try this instead. Application window. Hopefully, we'll get there eventually. Oh, there we go. Hopefully. It might take a while. I can still see Becky.
That's come up now, Mike. But yes, it's come up as your main presentation. So if you start the slideshow.
Oh, great! Can other people see that? Because what you should be looking at is a sort of picture of a page from a magazine. Is that what you're seeing, Becky?
Yes, spot the scorpion.
Spot the waters. Oh, right. Oh, actually, oh, no, I've gone the wrong way now. Oh, dear. This is deeply unprofessional. You're thinking, how's he actually managed to keep his job over all these years? Well, Becky's right. You see, I was a Punch and Judy man for quite a while. And frankly, no class of slightly bored 18-year-olds holds any fear when you've had to deal with kids who are psychotic on chocolate biscuits. So Fingers crossed. Okay, can you see the Spot the Water Scorpion screen there? Hopefully you can. Tell me if you can't. Yes?
Yep.
Oh, I can't hear you. That's okay. Right, now then, fingers crossed, because I do work on ponds most of the time. And if you work on ponds, all sorts of things happen. You have lovely days out sometimes. And what I want to do today is encourage you to have some lovely days out in the ponds of the AONB. Maybe next year when the sun comes out and we're allowed back out. But if you work on ponds, this is the sort of thing you get quite often. People say, "Oh, ponds." This is a page from BBC Wildlife magazine a few years ago, and it's a Spot the Scorpion competition. It's actually the water scorpion, and if you're not quite sure what that is, don't worry. It's one down the bottom left-hand corner there. It looks a little bit like a sort of brown leaf in the water, 3 or 4 centimeters long, and it's got quite fierce front legs for grabbing passing prey. And people come up and say, "Oh, Mike, you'd be good at this. Can we spot where the water scorpion is in this picture?" A bit like those old spot the bull competitions. And you sit there thinking, "Oh dear, I'm trying to be an eminent international expert here, and people want me to do spot the water scorpion." And you know what people are thinking? People are thinking to themselves, well, it's not exactly the Large Hadron Collider, is it? Ponds. That is the Large Hadron Collider. If you're not sure what that is, it's this huge thing in Europe which they use to smash atoms. Vastly expensive and fascinating, and also a bit of machinery that was famously brought to a halt when a bird dropped a bit of croissant down one of its exhaust chimneys. So that tells you a little bit about the nature of that science. So I don't do that sort of thing. What I do is work on ponds. And the first message, if anyone ever sort of despises ponds to you, ponds are the most widespread habitat on the land surfaces of planet Earth. We ignore them, we overlook them because they're familiar. Ponds are found everywhere. They're found underneath Antarctic ice sheets. They're found in the middle of deserts. They're found on tiny islands and huge continents. They're found in the countryside and the cities. There's some ponds there, top left, out in the American prairies. In the middle there with that lovely red dragonfly, a dried up salt pan in Spain. And in the top right, an Australian billabong. Look carefully, bottom left, and there's a pond at the foot of that eroding glacier, a Chinese countryside pond. And look at that scientific paper, bottom right there. Wouldn't you want to read a scientific paper that's talking about the ponds on Mars? I certainly would. So ponds are a universal habitat on the lands of planet Earth and maybe other planets too. But on the other hand, I still get this a lot of ponds. This is what you do with ponds. You take kids out and you pick plants and you put them in other ponds. And there's absolutely no harm in doing that. I love doing that. I seldom get the chance these days. But there's some youngsters out at Druidge Bay pulling out some plants from one site to take to another. And you might well have done that sort of thing, whether in the AONB or not. Nothing wrong with that. But still this idea that, that's kind of what ponds are about, really. Because ponds are so familiar and they're often quite small and they're parts of larger landscapes, whether it's the dune slacks of the AONB or coastal ponds or maybe slightly brackish ones on salt marshes, they tend to be part of a bigger thing. So we don't always look after them quite so well. There's another problem because a lot of ponds are created by people. There's no harm in that. Here's some examples. Top left there, a moat around a beautiful old building. That's a perfectly good pond. In the middle, a curling pond from Scotland. Admittedly, it has to freeze over to curl, but it's still a very good pond a lot of the rest of the time. Or mysterious structures, often in the uplands of England and elsewhere, as a dew pond in the top right there. So cool because people assume the water comes from dew. Or along the bottom there, left to right, a pond at Longhurst Golf Course. Perfectly good ponds just near Morpeth, a lot of them. The pond by the castle on Holy Island. I wonder how long that's been there and that's been used. It's very much a feature of the landscape where the water drains in. And bottom right there, a pond created by the Luftwaffe in Gosforth in World War II. I don't think pond creation was high on the Luftwaffe's agenda, but that's where some bombs got dropped just on the edge of Gosforth Golf Course. And perfectly good ponds, they all are. Although people might look at them and say, well, they're not very natural, are they? There's a lot of not very natural habitat in Britain that's great for wildlife. So again, Don't lose sight of that. There's also the significance of ponds to people. I mean, and I think for a lot of people, this is very important. If any of you are my age, you might remember the slightly older version of the pond in the middle of Eldon Square shopping mall. Sadly removed now, but there it is on the left. Kids used to throw money in it, in an echo of putting gifts or money or precious objects into sacred sites and mystical sites. And certainly in Northumberland, well, the great old Saxon poem Beowulf, Grendel's mother, if you're not familiar with the poem, don't you worry, but Beowulf had to fight a monster called Grendel, who kept on raiding his lord's hall. And he deals with Grendel, but Grendel's mother is even worse. And she lives in a pond. She might have lived in a pond in Northumberland. Imagine those Saxons encamped at Bamborough, maybe reciting the terrifying poem of Beowulf and Grendel's mother in this pond. You could barely walk past a pond in fairy stories without some beautiful maiden trying to give you a magical sword or some ghastly creature trying to drag you to your doom. So ponds are very important in our folklore too. Ponds also have some interesting conceptual problems, because people often say to me, what is a pond? And I tend not to worry about it, because we tend to know one when we see one. And you might be familiar, but again, don't worry if you're not, with the famous physics debate about Schrodinger's cat. And it's a thought experiment. If you have a cat in a box and you can't see in, the cat is simultaneously dead and alive, theoretical physicists tell you. And that's the sort of thing that gives theoretical physics, you know, people think, well, that's classy, never mind ponds. But the same thing applies to ponds. Here's a pond in Northumberland. And you're sitting there looking at it going, it's not a pond, it's a field of wheat. No, well, sometimes it's a field of wheat. And sometimes it's a pond. Just depends when you go. So again, you know, don't get too hung up on precise definitions of what a pond is. There are some precise definitions which are very widely used, but hey, don't worry about it too much. As well, I talked to you last time. It was lovely to dip in last time. It's smashing to be invited along, as I say, to today. I think last time I was talking to, just briefly, I thought, I'll look at the AONB website. They're bound to talk about their ponds. And here's the page about important habitats. We've got seabird colonies. Yes, that's good. I get that. Sand dunes. I love the sand dunes. Salt marsh. Some lovely, beautiful bits of salt marsh. Sandy and muddy shores. Wind grasslands. Maritime coastal slopes. Coastal heath. And maybe that's what the person there on the right-hand side is doing. They're staring at that guy and thinking, well, where are the ponds? Because there's ponds in amongst the sand dunes and the salt marshes and on the sandy shores, right next to the wind grassland and on the coastal. There's ponds throughout the AONB. But because they're often a small part of a bigger thing, we overlook them. So I wanted to give you just a feel for the status of ponds in Northumberland, and then a little bit about some of the AONB ponds, and then also finish off with some top tips of what you can do so easily. So first of all, people often think, understandably, that the numbers of ponds in the UK and elsewhere are in decline. And it is a very typical lost pond. You can maybe just see a remnant speck of water in the middle there with willow. I mean, maybe Grendel's mother would like a pond like that, but most other pond wildlife would not. And here's a bit of data. And admittedly, it's data from, I'm going, oh dear, I pinged right back to the end of the talk. That's very unprofessional. So I'm having to whiz very quickly back up. I'm sorry about this. I'm giving all the surprises away. Oh, dearie me. This is a study from southeast Northumberland. Now, I know that is not the AONB, because the AONB sort of starts where respectable National Trust Northumberland starts, whereas these bits south of Amble aren't entirely respectable, are they? And it's the southeast coastal plain, in particular, where a lot of the old coal mining took place. And it's a study just based on maps in that area. And it's an area which always intrigues me, because you've got this funny mixture of old industry, in a way very urban, working class communities in some respects, but living in the countryside. And a lot of that's gone now. I mean, the coal jobs aren't there. The mines have all closed. The bottom left photograph, the famous chimneys of the old smelter at Alnmouth, well, they're no longer there. They went a few years ago. So it's a funny mix, this, of heavy industry and countryside. So a couple of years ago now, I started to think, well, I'm sure I could trace the fate of the ponds in that area, because people know quite a bit about ponds in Suffolk and Norfolk and Cheshire, but not the northeast. And what you're kind of looking at now is a screen which shows you 4 boxes. Each box is a small section of various editions of the Ordnance Survey maps. Now, the Ordnance Survey maps go to about mid-Victorian era. The old maps are great. They show you things down to what are described as 4 yards in diameter, which is many ponds. And they often say on the old maps, pond, which is helpful. Less so on more recent maps. And here's just an example of where you can track the fate of a pond feature in old maps through the different editions from old to more recent. And you can see various changes like hedgerows that disappear, but you can see whether a pond comes or goes. Now, admittedly, it's only the ponds that show on maps, which is not all ponds by any means, but it gives you a flavour. And here's a very simple summary of the data. This, as I say, is from southeast Northumberland, so not the AONB area, but I suspect broadly similar pattern along the coastal plain. There are, on those old Victorian maps, and the additions vary slightly year to year, but 222 ponds. There are more ponds now on those maps than there were. So the idea that we're inevitably losing ponds is not true. And in many parts of Britain, there are now more ponds than there maybe were 50 years ago. Not everywhere, but in many places. This is potentially good news. Depends a little bit on the nature of the ponds, though. And there's the overall numbers at the top. And I've tried to put on the coloured blocks underneath broadly the fate of these ponds. The old ponds are nearly all field ponds associated with farming. A lot of them disappear as you get mining start to appear, slag heaps, open cast, loss of farms. And then in southeast Northumberland, you get subsidence ponds appearing. I've got maps of some of the old coal work underneath those ponds. And those seams are massive. They're so near the surface. Lord knows why the whole thing hasn't collapsed in on itself, but it hasn't. And then you've got ponds on nature reserves and ponds on golf courses. Very few of those old ponds from the mid-Victorian era survive. Only 23 of them out of the 222. A lot of the ponds have gone. The ponds change, they turn over. A lot of the contemporary ponds are golf course ponds. They're ponds on nature reserves. And that is itself quite interesting. Are the golf course ponds broadly the same as those old ponds in terms of the wildlife they support? Now, here's some of the examples. I think I showed these kind of examples previously to you. Top left there, an old farm pond, very filled in, but you can see where the cattle are sort of drinking round the edge. A subsidence pond, slap bang in the middle of a farmer's field. He probably doesn't want it there, but is that an interesting, significant pond? A pond dug for pond dipping in the bottom left at Druridge Bay, or the ponds that are formed in the old World War II field defences. So we've got a lot of intriguing ponds in southeast Northumberland. And here's just an aerial view of a bit of Ordnance Survey map. Bottom end of Druridge Bay, just a bit north of Cresswell and Ellington Village. And I've put little round circles over the ponds that show on this map. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, well, there's at least 9 of them there, plus the main lagoon at Cresswell. If you walk round that very same area in a wet year, there's over 100 little ponds that form in the hollows and dimples over the old mine works. That is a phenomenal density of ponds. There's nothing like it elsewhere in the UK. There maybe is in a part of Germany, in Silesia, and a part of China, where there are coal works. Northumberland is a very special spot for these subsidence ponds. And yet they're barely recognised, largely ignored, overlooked and unloved. What about the AONB though? And I don't know much about the ponds in the AONB. I've looked at some of them and I would like to look at more of them. I need an excuse to get out of the office, but here are some tantalizing possibilities. Anyone know where that pond is? Oh, I'm not sure I can hear you. That's an interesting thing. I wonder if you can hear me. I hope so.
Yeah, we can all hear you.
Oh,
Just all be polite.
I suddenly realised, Becky, you've been polite, because I can't see or hear any of you. You can all quite easily sneak out of your rooms now going, this bloke knows nothing what he's talking about. Schrodinger's cat. Oh, dear. Anyone know where this pond is?
I don't. If anyone else does, unmute yourself.
Don't mind if you don't. It's in the quarry on Holy Island, in the very tucked away northeast corner. There's an old quarry, and right in the bottom, this teeny little pond. You know, it's nothing big, nothing huge. Just in the hollow, I guess it just collects the rainfall. And if you look at it and take a photograph, and that's what the photograph is on the right-hand side, there's kind of two plants fairly visible there. I think there's a plant at the bottom, a sort of spiky little thing sticking up, and then there's a plant at the top, more sort of fluffy and feathery, with tiny little white flowers. The plant at the bottom is a thing called shoreweed, which is a fairly blunt description of how it grows. It's a weed that grows around the shores of ponds. And the fluffy stuff is a water buttercup. There are quite a lot of species of water buttercup. They have a mixture of quite feathery leaves and sometimes floating leaves. Now, I was looking at this and thinking, well, this is odd. Let me show you a couple of maps. On the left, it's a map for shoreweed, and there's a picture of the shoreweed again. And on the right there, another map for a plant called various-leaved pondweed. You'll be thinking, well, it's hardly a very creative name, is it? But it has various shaped leaves. That's why it's got that name. And it's difficult to see perhaps on the maps, because the maps, the red dots, record known records for these species in the UK. And I've only given you the sort of northern part of the UK. And you can see there for the shoreweed on the right-hand side, well, it's quite widespread in Scotland, even up into the Highlands and Islands. The various-leaved pondweed is a bit more sort of widespread, but it's got quite a Scottish distribution, goes a bit down to the uplands of Yorkshire. I put a circle round, it's hard to see, I put a circle round a dot for Holy Island, where there is a little red record. It's slightly pale, it's unconfirmed. Well, I can confirm it, they are there. So we've got two plants here, which are fairly Scottish in their distributions, including one, shoreweed, which you will find growing around the edges of Scottish lochs up in the Highlands. What on earth are they doing in the pond on Holy Island in the quarry? Stuck on an island, out at sea, virtually at sea level. They are a long way from home. That is fascinating. I have no idea what they're doing there or how they got there. It seems a completely inappropriate habitat for them rather than acid lochs in the Highlands. There's something fascinating about these ponds. Or take these ponds. This is, in the picture, a pond on Ross Links. Again, I seldom get the chance to go to Ross Links. And underneath it, a red-veined darter. The red-veined darter is quite widespread on the continent. It migrates into the UK occasionally. It has a very reddish hue to its wings. You can see where it's been spotted. Newcastle, a couple of dots on Holy Island up towards Edinburgh. Has it never been spotted on Ross Links or along the Northumberland coast? Because that's where it tends to occur further south. I bet no one really has looked. Never mind the red-veined darter. What about this creature? This is the vagrant emperor dragonfly. Again, a thing that migrates in, that does occasionally breed in the south of England. So there's a couple of dots there from Tyneside, a dot from North Berwick, and nothing along the Northumberland coast. Do I think the vagrant emperor turns up on the Northumberland coast and says, well, I don't like the look of Bamburgh, I won't stay there? No. We've never looked enough for dragonflies. I bet there are all sorts of things for you to find along the coast of the AONB. Or this is a little damselfly. Small red damselfly is its name. It's quite a good name because it's smaller than the big red-eyed damselfly and it has red eyes. It only arrived in Britain in 1999 on the south coast. You can see it's been spreading north. It has got as far as, well, Bolden, just in South Tyneside. Imagine that up the Northumberland coast. Perfectly possible. It's got a very coastal distribution further south. Maybe it's there already and we've never looked for it. Has that given you some ideas maybe for next year to go dragonfly and damselfly hunting on the ponds of the AONB? I bet there are special things out there. Wouldn't it be great to go out and spot them? But if you have to justify ponds, there might be other reasons as well. Here's two people. That's Dave on the right, as I left there, and Scott, one of our students, on the right. And with Dave and Scott and a couple of other people, Pete and Pippa and Mike, we thought, well, a few years ago, I wonder how much carbon ponds are mopping up. We know ponds are great for wildlife. Maybe they're overlooked for other reasons as well. So if the AONB ever had to justify a little bit of pond creation, and there was some science bubbling up suggesting that ponds could be really good carbon sinks. Here's again, it's a lovely paper from about 12 years ago now, and it was an estimate by an American of how many ponds there are on planet Earth, how big an area they cover, and his estimate was 0.8 billion square kilometers of ponds on planet Earth, which was quite a shock as an estimate, because that's considerably more than the entire land surface of planet Earth. Makes you wonder how this stuff sneaks through into the scientific literature, but there we are. Nonetheless, you know, it was an interesting idea. And what we did, we went out and we took cores, primary cores. So there's Dave and Pete coring some little ponds at Druridge Bay and in some of the fields in Northumberland, and then taking it back to the lab. And that's Dave laughing in the dark as we unveiled the cores and see, we have no idea what we were doing. We thought we'd try to measure the amount of carbon in the sediments of ponds. How much? Because we kind of know how much there is in the soils of woodlands and grasslands, and you can't turn the radio or TV on without someone saying, oh, we need to be planting more trees to mop up carbon. Well, maybe ponds are being a bit overlooked here again. And we also had an interesting opportunity at Hawksley at Druridge Bay, because in 1994, I dug out some little ponds in a field to monitor the comings and goings of the freshwater animals. And because we know exactly the age of these little ponds to the day, and because they were dug out on quite sticky brown clay, you can maybe see on that right-hand picture, there's a sort of black wiggly line about halfway up where we've dug out that pond. Underneath the black wiggly line, it's the clay. Above that, it's the sediment that was deposited in the 20 or so years of that pond's life. So we were able to dig out that sediment with a precisely known age and work out how much carbon that pond had buried. It's a very typical little pond. It's tiny, but very typical vegetation, very typical plants. It's quite a muddy job. You'll be sitting there thinking, why isn't Mike doing any of the digging in those pictures or lugging the boxes around? I must point out that Scott, on the left-hand side there, he worked as a bouncer on the Diamond Strip in Newcastle during his PhD. So he was very good for digging ponds out. So I let him do it. I concentrated more on the photographic record. Becky can at this point roll her eyes. So we have a pretty good idea of the amount of carbon being buried over the age of a pond. And here, if you want a ballpark figure, and there's Pete and Scott doing some more coring, if you want a ballpark figure of how much carbon is trapped in the sediments of typical lowland ponds in the UK, it's probably just a bit over 9 kilograms of organic carbon in a block, a metre square, and 20 centimetres deep. Now, that, of course, is one of those kind of massive generalisations that science kind of gets away with. That is a figure based on ponds in Northumberland, some ponds in Norfolk, some ponds in Yorkshire, and some ponds in Devon, all combined. There's actually a surprising lack of difference. You'd think they would be more different than they are. It's a very useful ballpark figure. Think of it as about 9 bags of sugar, equivalent of 9 bags of sugar in an area, a metre square, 20 centimetres deep. The key issue is, well, so what? How does that compare to other systems? Woodlands, grasslands, things you always hear about, but a tree planting. It is very considerably more. That is a lot more than you get in woodlands and you get in grasslands. It's about the same as you get in other wetlands. And I've also got a colleague, Mike Deary, who works in my department, has got some beautiful data from salt marshes over on the Solway Firth. And they're really the first estimates of carbon in salt marshes for this country. And again, from the AONB's point of view, if you wanted to work out the value of the, if you wanted to put a figure on the AONB, a financial figure, you could work out in terms of the carbon economy based on these figures what those ponds represent. So there's that sort of straightforward instrumental value. Oh, spare me any more things about tree planting. I don't mind trees. Some trees are my best friends. I talk to them regularly on my walk around the block here. But when it comes to carbon sequestration, ponds bury carbon fast and they hold it in their sediments. Well, more or less, because they can also give it out. And here's Pete's doing some measuring using floating chambers that capture the gas and tell you how the carbon dioxide and methane are going back and forth in the ponds. I'm not entirely sure what he's doing in that right-hand photograph. I don't think he's going to spot any carbon dioxide doing that. But anyway, far be it from me to say. So we have also pretty good estimates of the rates, in particular of carbon dioxide and how it comes and goes. It can change quite dramatically. Ponds can switch between being sinks and sources, which is a bit of a dilemma. But bearing in mind the amount they're accumulating in their sediments, they appear to be, on the whole, powerful carbon sinks. But there's very good evidence elsewhere in the world, and there's some pictures. Ponds created for feeding cattle in Australia, ponds in temperate woodlands in the northern USA, Arctic tundra ponds in particular, that they could be important sources of methane, a very potent greenhouse gas. So the science is still a little bit up in the air. Now, I was a bit taken aback the other, because I suspect many of you, like myself, watched David Attenborough's program on extinctions a year ago. And right towards the end, you suddenly got these scientists, and the description in the narrative was they were walking out over this lake, and one of them had a sort of flaming torch, and the other punched a hole through the ice on the lake. And then the second person held the torch over it, and this great whoomph of flame appeared. It was like scientists as bit part players in Game of Thrones. And what they were doing, they were igniting the methane that was trapped in bubbles under the ice. And the camera panned back, and I thought, oh no, that's not a lake, that's a pond. And you might understandably get the distinct message that these ponds up in the Arctic and the northern realms could be a powerful source of methane. The jury is still out. It looks like, on the whole, though, ponds hold and trap carbon very effectively. They're only going to start releasing it if we warm up the atmosphere too much. This has been known for a long time. Nothing new here. This is a painting. Well, I never thought I'd show a pre-Raphaelite painting in a lecture. I've always thought that pre-Raphaelite paintings should be held in dungeons and never shown daylight. Maybe if Andy Warhol had done it, but never mind. And this is a painting of the great British chemist John Dalton, who in 1815 collected methane from ponds, part of his very original work about the existence of molecules. So we've known this for a long time. It's just, I suppose, that was a rather more decorous age, whereas these days we stand around looking at ponds, scratching our heads, trying to wonder, well, what should we do? So to sum up the ponds and carbon, ponds are significant in the carbon cycle. It looks like the flux rates are quite good, but it could be that ponds are a bit of a dilemma for methane. What kind of ponds will be carbon traps? Well, maybe that's a talk for another time, because we already know, never mind the carbon, that ponds are the best and easiest thing you can do to boost biodiversity. I mean, you can't create ancient woodland unless you've got a time machine handy, and although that's theoretically possible, I don't suppose the AONB can afford one. Here are some beautiful little ponds dug in the dune slacks at Low Newton in the AONB. These were dug in 1995. You can see they're small. They're not big. The ones on the left-hand side, as the right side, they're not big. They were dug out as a bit of a conservation gesture. I know, because I've sampled these ponds, that those ponds have more species of freshwater life in them than a bigger pond of the equivalent area, as if that whole little bit of wetland had been dug out. The individual ponds are surprisingly different. You can see it if you walk just across to them. They've got different plants in. They weren't planted to be like that. They have accumulated different species just naturally, and they now hold a greater diversity. Pond clusters like that, which dry out most years, that again is not an issue, but surrounded by a lovely buffer of wetland and rough grassland, that is a great way to boost biodiversity locally. That is something the AONB could easily do in many places. Now, I know there's all sorts of myths about pond creation. You can still see it in a lot of the literature. Don't worry about things like your pond has to be 2 meters deep or your newts will freeze. Lots of ponds are not 2 meters deep. Bigger is not necessarily better. Here is a simple set of top tips. There's great advice on the website of the Freshwater Habitats Trust. Here's the top tips for pond creation. Clean water. It sounds obvious, but you know, ponds have often been put in places where you've not got a lot of clean water. Clean water is what you need. It's better to have a small pond with clean water than a big pond with a dodgy water source. Clean water. Have a surrounding buffer of natural vegetation. Those ponds you can see have got a lovely surround of wetland, swampy, wet grassland. Much better to have that rather than dig out the whole area as one big pond. Lots of creatures like that surrounding zone. It gives them a bit of security as they come and go. A lot of them like that in-betweeny mixture of wetland. It's not exactly land, it's not exactly pond. Keep a large area of surrounding buffer. It's also very good for stopping nutrients and sediment runoff and general disturbance. Dig a cluster of ponds, not one big pond. The cluster will soon vary pond to pond. You can have some deeper ones, you can have some shallow ones, some bigger, some smaller. Dig a cluster. Many ponds are temporary, especially in the AONB. You have to worry if a pond dries up that hasn't dried up for 20, 30, 50, 100 years. If it's a permanent pond that suddenly dries up, that is a bit worrying. Many ponds dry up naturally. Some years, maybe, not others, maybe. Don't worry about it. Temporary ponds are great. Don't try to make temporary ponds permanent. There was some famous work done to try to help natterjack toads over in the dunes of Lancashire, where temporary ponds were dug deeper so they didn't dry out. Then, of course, it turns out the natterjack toads like the ponds that dry out because you don't get fish and you don't get large, long-lived invertebrate predators. Don't plant up ponds. Let nature take its course. On the coastal sites, further south certainly, the non-native invasive species are in the sites that have been planted up by nature conservation organisations. They're seldom on the sites that haven't been. Easy, isn't it? A lot of that is a recipe for doing less. Dig smaller ponds. Don't dig them deep. Don't plant them up. Ponds are one of the easiest things you can do. They also have lots of things maybe less expected. This is some work primarily from Norfolk. And you can see the open country. You can still hear it on iPlayer, BBC iPlayer. The Norfolk ponds have a huge benefit to pollinators. Bees, butterflies, hoverflies. It's a great thing for farmers to have in their fields because the pollinators benefit from the flowers around about. Ponds are great for birds. Beautiful data showing the swallows and swifts and martins. Most farmland birds home in on ponds as a source of insect food. So never mind all those obscure little critters that live in temporary ponds. Butterflies, swallows, it's an easy sell for people. So I think next year for your team, those AONB ponds are calling, aren't they? That beautiful mist-shrouded pond on the snook of Holy Island as you walk up towards the old cottage. Or the mysterious ponds in the dunes, there are some unusual species of beetles there. Or the little ponds at Low Newton tucked around in that little bit of wetland at the foot of the exposed whin. That is technically fenland. If you do the National Vegetation Classification, those are fen ponds. Where else do you find fen ponds in Northumberland? Not many other places. And maybe above all, go out to the AONB, take your binoculars with you and your cameras and your dragonfly and damselfly identification books, because I think there are some fascinating things to be discovered there. And hopefully that will encourage you and hopefully it will get you out. And hopefully this is all good news and stuff that's useful and helpful. But on the other hand, I know what you really want to know, don't you? You want to know what happened with that water scorpion competition, because you can see there's a very nice watch there on the right-hand side to be won. Well, I used all my expertise. I analysis of variance and canonical correspondence analysis, and I could conclusively prove that the water scorpion should be found in F5. That's where it should be living. I'm absolutely certain of that. But unfortunately, the answer turned out, apparently, to be K16. And the watch, according to BBC Wildlife magazine, was won by a 9-year-old from Plymouth. Hey, if that hasn't completely shattered your confidence in everything I've had to say, it's been lovely talking, and I hope it will inspire you to get out and about and go out and look at the end of this dreadful year, next year, at all those wonderful ponds on the AONB. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike. It was really interesting. I'm sure everyone else found the same. Just going to say a couple of things. Obviously, we've done a little bit of pond management as well, but we did a BioBlitz at Embleton last summer. So I've had a quick look at the species list while I was listening. So it was common dart, a common hawker, and a blue-tailed damselfly, and that was all that was seen on that site. But yeah, obviously we would have liked to have gone again there this summer, but obviously with the situation we've been in, we haven't been able to. But yeah. So does anyone have any questions for Mike?
Yeah, I've got one. It's just your last slide showed ponds in the dune slack.
Yes.
But I don't know if you've noticed or if you walk over the AONB dunes regularly, but they look like they're drying out more than filling up with water. Is that just a natural cycle, or do you think they will come back?
It is the sort of thing that it can be a bit worrying, isn't it? I've been there some years. I used to go very regularly. I used to go 3 times a year for 5 years to sample them. There were some years it'd be bone dry, and other years the whole of that dune slack would be wet, so you couldn't see the individual ponds. On the whole, it really doesn't worry me. I guess most of the ponds and sites I work on are relatively shallow, even the subsidence ponds in southeast Northumberland. And the big deal about temporary ponds, it's where all the rare pond species actually live in the UK. They like temporary ponds. The temporary ponds don't accumulate fish. Very long-lived